bell that rang before every murder. Whitechapel, 1888. Chapter 1: The First Bell. There are cities that breathe, and cities that merely exist. London in the autumn of 1888 did neither. It festered. It crouched beneath its own fog like a wounded animal, pulling the damp cold over its shoulders as though the gray weight of cloud and coal smoke were a blanket it deserved. The Thames moved sluggishly through its heart, black and indifferent, carrying with it the refuse of empire. The bones of great ambition ground to silt, the discarded dreams of a million souls pressed together in tenements and rookeries, in workhouses and gin palaces, and the rank corridors of institutions that smelled of carbolic and despair. Whitechapel was the easternmost wound. It was not merely poor. Poverty in its ordinary form carries a kind of anonymity, a gray blankness that allows the suffering to be misread as simply the absence of comfort. Whitechapel's poverty was different. It had texture, smell, sound. It pressed against you in the narrow lanes called streets, barely wide enough for two men to pass without turning sideways, and it breathed hot and foul into your face through the open doorways of lodging houses, where 14 people slept in a room designed for 4, where a bed was rented by the hour, where children who had forgotten the concept of shoes ran on feet blackened permanently by cobblestones that had never been clean. The gas lamps along Commercial Street did their inadequate best. They threw circles of amber light onto the wet pavements, each lamp an island surrounded by a sea of impenetrable darkness. In between them the shadows were absolute, and in those shadows anything might happen and frequently did. The police knew this. The residents knew this. The newspapers that printed their screaming headlines in bold Gothic type knew this particularly well, because screaming headlines required screaming material, and Whitechapel in 1888 was providing material enough to fill every front page in London for months to come. The murders had begun in August. The first victim, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols, had been found in Bucks Row on the last day of that month, and the details of her death, printed with a frankness that would be considered extraordinary by any civilized measure, had sent a particular kind of chill through the city that went beyond ordinary horror. This was not the chill of shock or disgust, though those elements were certainly present. This was the chill of recognition. Something old and nameless had arrived, and the city knew it in its bones before its mind had fully processed the information. By October, the newspapers were using a name, Jack the Ripper. The name had appeared first in a letter sent to the Central News Agency, a letter that may or may not have been genuine, written in a hand that suggested education overlaid with deliberate roughness, as though someone literate had tried to write as an illiterate and had only partially succeeded. The name stuck with the particular tenacity of names that feel true, that capture something essential about the thing they describe, even if the person who coined it had no special knowledge of its subject. But what the newspapers did not print, what the police had quietly suppressed, what the witnesses in Whitechapel whispered only to one another in the shuttered intimacy of lodging house kitchens and dark pub corners, was the matter of the bell. The bell at St. Anselm's had rung before every murder. St. Anselm's Church stood at the far end of Flower and Dean Street, its Victorian Gothic facade rising from the surrounding warren of crooked buildings like a man standing up in a crowd, unexpected, out of proportion, somehow wrong. It had been built in 1852 by a charitable organization that had since dissolved, intended as a spiritual anchor for the destitute population of the surrounding streets. For 18 years it had served this purpose under the ministration of a succession of priests, the last of whom, a Father Edmund Harrow, had died within its walls in 1870 under circumstances that the church records described, with some care, as a sudden illness of the spirit. After Father Harrow's death, the church had simply ceased to function. No new priest had been assigned. The charitable organization that owned it had fragmented into legal disputes. The building sat empty, accumulating the particular silence of holy spaces abandoned, a silence that was somehow heavier than ordinary silence, freighted with the memory of prayer and the absence of any answer. On the night of the 29th of September, 1888, the bell in St. Anselm's Tower rang at exactly 12 minutes past midnight. It rang slowly, with the measured deliberation of a bell rung by human hands rather than the random clatter of wind-struck metal. 7 slow strokes rolled out across the rooftops of Whitechapel, pushing through the fog, finding their way down narrow alleys and into the half-consciousness of the few who slept and the unease of the many who did not. The sound was enormous. The bell was large, cast in the previous century from bronze that had gone green and rough with age, and it spread across the neighborhood like a stone dropped into still water, ripple upon ripple growing fainter but never quite dying. 7 strokes, then silence. Margaret Fells, a laundress who lived on Thrall Street, woke from a light sleep with the sound dissolving around her. She sat up in her narrow bed, listening. The fog pressed against her window glass. Somewhere below, a horse shifted in its traces and a cab wheel ground against wet stone. Then nothing. She would tell the police 3 days later that she had thought nothing of it at first, that she had assumed she was hearing things, or that perhaps the bell had been rung by some accident, a rope loosened by rats, the mechanism freed by the cold, that she had pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes and tried to return to sleep. That it was only 20 minutes later, when the police whistles began shrieking in the street below and feet came running on the cobblestones, that the connection had formed in her mind, sudden and cold and completely certain, the way the worst realizations always arrive, not as something learned but as something remembered. The bell had rung, and then someone had died. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were found within 40 minutes of each other that night, in what the newspapers would later call the double event. The details of their deaths were terrible enough to be printed in the papers in carefully bowdlerized form, the horror suggested rather than stated, the reader's imagination trusted to complete what decency required to be left unwritten. But the bell, 7 strokes at 12 past midnight, was not mentioned in any newspaper. The police inspector who had been awakened by the sound, who had noted the time in his personal diary as he lay in his lodgings on Lemon Street listening to it roll through the night, had filed no official report about it. He could not explain the bell's ringing. The church was locked and had been locked for years. And unexplained phenomena in an already sensational case were not things he wished to commit to official record. He was a practical man. But he lay awake for a long time after the whistles stopped, in his small room above the grocer's shop, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain. The rain came harder after midnight. It always seemed to in those weeks of autumn, as though the sky itself were appalled at what the darkness contained and were attempting, with increasing desperation, to wash the streets clean. It drummed on the slate rooftops and cascaded from broken gutters and pooled in the uneven cobblestones, reflecting the gas lamps in shivering fragments of amber. In the alley where Catherine Eddowes had been found, the rain mixed with darker things, and a young constable who had been first on the scene stood very still in the downpour and tried not to be sick. He was 19 years old. He had been a constable for 3 months. He had expected his profession to be hard, but he had expected a different kind of hard, the hard of cold nights and long beats and the occasional drunken brawl. He had not expected this. He stood in the rain and thought about the bell he had heard, rolling out across the rooftops from the direction of Flower and Dean Street. And he thought about the muddy footprints he had noticed, before the rain had washed them away, leading from the direction of St. Anselm's Church toward Mitre Square where the second victim had been found. Large footprints, long stride, moving neither fast nor slow, with the unhurried deliberation of someone who has decided exactly where they are going and sees no reason to hurry. He did not mention the footprints in his report either. He was, in his 19-year-old way, also a practical man. The next morning the newspapers screamed. The city shuddered. The residents of Whitechapel pulled their curtains tighter against the daylight and spoke in low voices, and in the pubs and lodging houses and on the street corners where people gathered to exchange what they knew and what they feared, the bell was mentioned, cautiously, quietly, by those who had been awake to hear it. 7 strokes, said old William Farrow, who kept the news stand on the corner of Commercial Street, at 12 past midnight. I know it, I heard it, and then all hell came loose. You were dreaming, someone said. I was not dreaming, said William Farrow. I never dream. He was wrong about the second part, as most people are, but he was entirely right about the first. The bell had rung before the murders. It would ring again. Chapter 2: The Watchman's Story. His name was Thomas Crail, and he had been watching Whitechapel for 11 years. Not officially. Thomas Crail held no police appointment, wore no uniform, carried no warrant card. His official occupation, as recorded in the census of 1881, was night watchman, employed by a rope manufacturer on Cable Street to guard their premises between the hours of 10 at night and 6 in the morning. He had held this position since 1877, when the rope manufacturer, a solid, suspicious man named Arthur Penhaligon, had decided that the quantity of rope disappearing from his storeroom each week was too large to be explained by rats alone, and had hired the first reliable-looking man he encountered at the local labor exchange. Thomas Crail had been reliable. The theft had stopped. Arthur Penhaligon asked no questions about how this had been achieved, and Thomas Crail offered no explanations. They had arrived at the comfortable arrangement of mutual ignorance that defines many long-lasting professional relationships. What Thomas Crail did during his 11 years of night watching, in the hours when the rope was secure and the storeroom quiet, and there was nothing to do but exist in the cold and the dark, what he did was watch. He had a route that he walked at intervals through the night, from the rope manufacturer's gates down to the river and back, and over the years this route had expanded and contracted and shifted according to no principle he could have articulated, until it traced a complicated path through a wide section of the East End that covered, among other locations, Flower and Dean Street and the front face of St. Anselm's Church. He had been watching St. Anselm's for 11 years. He had noticed things. Detective Sergeant Frederick Aberline of the Metropolitan Police found Thomas Crail by following a chain of whispers through the pubs and lodging houses of Whitechapel on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, 2 weeks after the double event. Aberline was a small, precise man with a large mustache and eyes that had seen enough of the East End to have developed a particular flat quality, the quality of eyes that have learned not to react to what they see because reacting would cost energy that is needed elsewhere. He was tired in the specific way of a man who has not slept properly in 2 months and has no expectation of sleeping properly for the foreseeable future. He found Crail in the public house called the 10 Bells on Commercial Street at 3 in the afternoon. The man sat alone at the end of the bar with a half-pint of mild in front of him and a cigarette burning down between his fingers, its smoke rising in a thin column through the amber air of the pub. He was perhaps 55, with a face that suggested more outdoor time than indoor, and hands that were large and very still on the bar surface, the hands of a man accustomed to waiting. "Mr. Crail," said Aberline, sitting down beside him without invitation. Crail turned to look at him. "Inspector," he said, though Aberline had not introduced himself or shown his warrant card. He seemed to already know. "Detective Sergeant," Aberline corrected. "I," said Crail, and returned his gaze to his glass. He took a slow pull of the mild and set it down with equal care. Aberline placed his notebook on the bar. "I'm told you have something to say about the bell." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man considering whether to speak. It was the silence of a man deciding how to begin something he has been wanting to say for a very long time. "The bell," said Thomas Crale at last, "rings before everyone. Every murder. Everyone, since August. Since the first one, the woman in Buck's Row." He took a drag of his cigarette. The coal burned orange in the afternoon light. "Before that too, though that's a longer story and you'll not want to hear it this afternoon." "Try me," said Aberline. Crale looked at him sideways, a quick, measuring look. Then he stubbed out his cigarette and turned on his stool to face the detective directly. It was the movement of a man who has decided to commit. "I've been on that route 11 years, he said. 11 years past the front of St. Anselm's 3-4 times a night, regular as clockwork. I know that building, I know its sounds. I know when it's quiet, and I know the sounds it makes when the wind comes off the river, the creak of the tower, the way the loose stones in the east wall shift and click, the sound of water in the gutter above the main door." He paused. "I know the bell." "The bell has rung before." Aberline had his pencil up now. Not the way it rang in September. Before that it rang only twice that I heard. Once in March of 1883, the night a woman was found in the court off Dorset Street strangled, never solved. And once in January of 1886, the night the old man was found in the river with his throat cut, the one they said was probably an accident. He said this last word with the particular flatness of a man who does not believe it. Both times the bell rang first, around midnight. A few strokes, slow and deliberate. And no one was in the tower. "The church has been locked since 1870, said Crale. "Father Harrow died in the vestry and they locked the doors, and they've never been properly opened since. There's a padlock on the main door, a police seal that's been renewed twice, and iron bars across the ground floor windows. The place is sealed." He picked up his glass, looked into it, set it down without drinking. "There's no one in the tower. There's no one alive in that building. I have looked." "You've been inside." The first ghost of something, not quite a smile, crossed Crale's face. "Not inside, no, I wouldn't go inside. But I've looked through every window that can be looked through from outside. I've walked around it 6 times after each ringing, in the fog, in the dark, with a lamp. I've seen nothing. No light. No movement. Nothing. And yet the bell rings." "The bell rings," said Crale, "and then somebody dies." The pub noise went on around them, the clatter of glasses, someone's laughter at the far end of the bar, the landlord's slow movement between customers. Aberline wrote in his notebook. "Tell me about September," he said. "September 29th. Crale put his hands flat on the bar surface as if steadying himself against the memory. "I was on my second round past 1 in the morning, coming up Flower and Dean Street from the Commercial Street end. The fog was heavy that night, very heavy, and I had my lamp low because it wasn't helping. The fog just threw the light back at you. I heard the bell start. 7 strokes. Slow." "And you stopped?" "I stopped, of course I stopped. I'd heard it before twice and knew what came after. I stood still and waited and listened. He was quiet for a moment, and that's when I saw him." Aberline looked up from his notebook. "Him." "A figure, coming down from the tower door, the old door in the tower's south face, about 30 feet up above a ledge. Shouldn't even be a door there, really. I'd never noticed it before, or never noticed it was usable. But it opened, and a figure came out." "A man." "A shape," said Crale with deliberate precision. "Tall, black coat, long, a hat wide-brimmed, the kind that hides a face. Moving along the ledge without hesitation, as though he knew every inch of it. Then he went around the side of the tower and I lost sight of him." "And then?" "And then I ran," said Thomas Crale, without any particular shame. "I ran back to the rope manufacturer's and I locked the gate and I sat in the storeroom for an hour. And when the whistles started, I knew what had happened." Aberline looked at this man, this careful, quiet night watchman with his large, still hands and his flat certainty, and decided that he was not drunk, not fantasizing, not seeking the attention that comes with proximity to famous crimes. He decided that Thomas Crale was telling him exactly what he had seen, with the particular precision of a man who spends long hours in the dark and has learned to trust his observations, because There is no one else to trust." "Have you told anyone else?" he asked. "I told my employer," said Crail, "Arthur Penhaligon. He said I was imagining things and gave me 2 shillings not to say anything further." "And before that, the other times?" Crail looked at his glass for a long moment. "I told a constable once, in 1883, after the woman in Dorset Street. He picked up the glass, drained it. He told me to go home and sleep it off. He set the glass down. I hadn't had a drink that night." Aberline closed his notebook. Around them the pub murmured and rattled. The gas lamps made everyone look slightly jaundiced, slightly unwell, which was appropriate because most of them were. "If you hear the bell again," said Aberline, "you will come directly to the station on Lemon Street. You will not go near the church. You will come to the station." "Yes," said Thomas Crail. "And Mr. Crail," Aberline stood, buttoning his coat, "the figure you saw on the ledge," he paused, "was there anything else, anything you noticed that you haven't mentioned?" Crail was quiet for so long that Aberline thought the conversation was over. Then the watchman said, very quietly, almost to his glass, "He wasn't climbing down. When he came out the door, he wasn't climbing down." A pause. "He was going up, moving up the side of the tower toward the bell chamber." Aberline stood very still. "But the bell," he said, "had already finished ringing." "Yes," said Thomas Crail, "that's what troubled me most." Outside, the fog was coming in off the river. It moved through the streets with a slow patience that resembled intention, filling the spaces between buildings, muffling the sounds of hooves and wheels, turning the gas lamps into pale suggestions of themselves. In Flower and Dean Street, the tower of St. Anselm's rose into the gray above the surrounding rooftops, its bell chamber a dark rectangle against the darker sky. It was silent now. But Aberline, walking back toward Lemon Street through the thickening afternoon fog, could feel the silence the way you feel the held breath of something waiting. Chapter 3: The Church with No Priest. The church records of St. Anselm's, Flower and Dean Street, had been transferred in 1871 to the offices of the Diocese of London, where they had been boxed, labeled with the optimism of bureaucracy, for review pending appointment of new incumbent, and placed in a cellar that flooded annually, ensuring that by 1888 much of their content had achieved a state of semi-legibility that required both patience and a certain tolerance for damp paper. Detective Sergeant Aberline brought both. He spent an entire afternoon in the diocesan basement with a young clerk named Patterson who had asthma and a tendency to sigh with particular expressiveness whenever a document crumbled between his fingers. Together, they assembled what could be assembled. St. Anselm's had been consecrated in 1852. Its first priest, a Father William Chambers, had served for 3 years before requesting a transfer to a parish in Yorkshire. His letter of request, partially intact, cited spiritual unease arising from the specific character of the location, without further elaboration, and the unease was apparently sufficient to justify the transfer because it was granted without question. His replacement had lasted 18 months. The third priest, a Father Joseph Marin, had served for 7 years before dying of consumption, which was ordinary enough. Father Edmund Harrow had been appointed in 1866 and had served for 4 years before his death in the vestry in November 1870. The death certificate, which Patterson located under a filing system that appeared to have been organized by someone with a philosophical objection to alphabetization, gave the cause of death as cardiac failure. It gave Harrow's age as 43. It gave the time of death as approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. It did not explain what a 43-year-old priest had been doing in his vestry at 2 o'clock in the morning. Aberline made notes. He noted the series of short tenures. He noted the language of Father Chambers' transfer request, spiritual unease, which was the kind of language clergy used when they wanted to say something specific without being specific. He noted the hour of Harrow's death. He noted the absence of any successor, the administrative silence that had followed the building's 18-year vacancy. He then requested the personal papers of Father Edmund Harrow, which he was informed might or might not exist, and which Patterson located, after an interval of considerable sighing, in a box that had been incompletely sealed, and had therefore admitted enough moisture over the years to weld its contents into a single object resembling a primitive brick. The preservation of the box's contents was consequently uneven, but there were fragments. There was a journal entry, dated October 1870, approximately 1 month before Harrow's death, in which the priest wrote, in a hand that showed agitation in its uneven spacing, "The bell again, 3 nights running. I hear it from the vestry where I sleep and I cannot determine its source. Bates says the mechanism has been disabled for years, that nothing in the tower could ring without a man pulling the rope. But I see no man. The sexton says he hears nothing. I begin to wonder if this affliction is mine alone." There was a letter, unsent, addressed to the Bishop of London, in which Harrow began to describe certain occurrences of an extraordinary nature within the church building, and then stopped mid-sentence, the letter trailing off as though the writer had been interrupted or had decided against completion. And there was a single page, the ink faded but legible, that appeared to be a list. Names, dates, locations. 12 names in total, each followed by a date and a brief description. The descriptions were abbreviated, cryptic in the way of private notes. Found, Dorset Court, Saturday, or River, Monday before dawn, but the dates were clear, and Aberline recognized 3 of them. They were nights when women had been found murdered in Whitechapel, not in 1888, in 1869, in 1870. Before Father Harrow's death. He sat back in his creaking chair in the diocesan basement and looked at the list for a long time. Patterson sneezed. The gas lamp on the desk made a small sound, a slight adjustment in its flame, and the shadows in the corners of the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Aberline thought about the bell. The following morning he obtained permission, after considerable administrative friction, to enter St. Anselm's Church. The police seal on the main door had been renewed, as Thomas Crail had said, in 1882 and again in 1887. The padlock was substantial, and the key, located after an exchange of letters with the diocesan office, had the slightly reluctant quality of a key that has never been used. It turned in the lock with a grinding resistance that suggested corrosion, and the door itself required the combined effort of Aberline and the young constable he had brought along, a steady, sensible man named Constable Mills, to swing open. The smell that came out was extraordinary, not the smell of rot or decay, which Aberline had been half expecting, but something older and stranger, the smell of stone that has been breathing in the dark for too long, of wood slowly releasing the memory of incense, of cold that has settled so deeply into a building that it has become part of its structure. And beneath those smells, fainter, something else. Something that neither man was able to name, but that made both of them pause on the threshold for a moment before they entered. The interior was large and dim. The windows, high in the nave walls, admitted a gray filtered light that fell on broken pews. Most had collapsed or been broken by the weight of accumulated damp, and on a flagstone floor over which water had, at various times, spread and receded, leaving tidal marks and patches of dark green moss. The ceiling was intact except for one area near the apse where something had failed and the plaster had come down, revealing the laths beneath like the ribs of an animal. Dead pigeons lay in the corners, perfectly preserved by the cold, like objects arranged without explanation. At the far end the altar stood. It was covered by a layer of white that turned out, on closer inspection, to be not a cloth but 17 years of dust, settled to such uniform depth that it gave the surface a sculptural quality, softening the altar's edges, making it look almost geological. "Quiet," said Constable Mills, which was not a sophisticated observation but was perfectly accurate. The silence of the place was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something held, suspended, waiting. They found the stairs to the tower behind a door at the north end of the nave, a heavy oak door with an iron ring handle that had been left unlocked. The stairs spiraled upward through the tower's interior, stone steps worn smooth in their centers by decades of use that had ended abruptly in 1870. The walls of the stairwell were damp and cold, and the lantern that Aberline carried threw climbing shadows above them as they ascended. It was on the third step that Constable Mills noticed the footprints. Mud dried to a pale brown pressed into the surface of the stone. Not smeared, not tracked randomly, specific, directional, the pattern of feet ascending in an unhurried and regular stride. The prints were large, suggesting a tall person, and the stride was long. They ascended without variation, one after another, upward into the tower. Aberline crouched to examine them. The mud was dry but not ancient, not 18 years old. He pressed a finger into the nearest print. The surface had the quality of something that had dried within weeks, perhaps less. He looked up at Constable Mills. "Going up," he said. They followed the prints up, past the first landing, past the second, up through the narrowing stairwell to the bell chamber itself. The chamber was open to the air on four sides through arched apertures, and the wind moved through it with a sound that was almost musical, a low, sighing passage of air around stone and metal. The bell hung in its frame, massive, green-dark with oxidation, its surface rough with age. The rope that had once been used to ring it was still attached, looped through the mechanism, hanging down toward the floor where it had been coiled many decades ago. The coil of rope had been disturbed. It had been handled recently. The dust that covered everything else in the chamber had been displaced on and around it, and the rope itself showed, in several places, the marks of recent grip, the fibers compressed in the pattern of human hands. The footprints in the mud ended at the center of the chamber. They did not come back. Aberline and Mills stood in the bell chamber with the wind moving around them, and looked at the footprints that simply stopped, at the rope that had been gripped by hands they could not account for, at the great green bell that hung above them in its ancient frame. Below, through the arched openings, Whitechapel spread in every direction under its customary overlay of fog and smoke and misery, the streets tiny and the people within them invisible at this height, the whole enormous geography of suffering made abstract by altitude. Aberline reached out and touched the bell's surface with his fingertips. The metal was cold. He had expected that. But there was something else, a faint vibration, so slight he couldn't be certain it was real, as though the bell were humming at a frequency just below audibility, as though it were in the act of recovering from a sound recently made. He took his hand away. They descended in silence. At the bottom of the stairs in the nave, Constable Mills stopped and looked back up toward the bell chamber. "The footprints," he said. "Yes," said Aberline. "They don't come down." "No," said Aberline, "they don't." He looked around the ruined nave for a long moment, at the dead pigeons in their perfect preservation, at the altar's layer of dust like snow that would not melt, at the windows through which the gray October light fell with the flat quality of light that has given up trying. Then he led the way out of the church, into the cold Whitechapel morning, and the door swung shut behind them with a sound like the closing of something very long ago decided. Chapter 4: The Woman in the Fog. Her name was Clara Holt, and she had the kind of face that people trusted immediately, which was both a professional advantage and a personal burden. She was 31, a seamstress who worked for a company in Aldgate and lived in a boarding house on White's Row, and her statement to the police on the morning of the 12th of October was the most coherent, precise, and troubling testimony they received in the entire course of the investigation. She had been returning home from a late job, a rush order for a shipping merchant's wife, who needed 3 dresses completed by morning, at approximately 11:30 on the night of October the 11th. She had been walking quickly because the night was cold, and because she was, like every woman in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, frightened of the dark in a way she had not been frightened of it 1 year before. She had turned into Flower and Dean Street from the commercial street end. The fog was heavy, not the light mist of an early autumn evening, but the solid, ground-hugging fog that came off the river in October, the kind that reduced visibility to a few yards and turned gas lamps into mere suggestions of themselves, smudges of dim orange in walls of gray. Clara walked fast, her heels on the cobblestones, her breath making small, quick clouds. She passed the lamp at the corner. She passed the dark front of a lodging house whose sign was invisible in the fog. She was perhaps 50 feet from the gates of St. Anselm's when she stopped. A woman was standing at the gates, not standing in the way of someone waiting, or someone who has paused to rest, or someone who happens to be positioned near a gate while thinking of something else entirely. Standing in the way of someone who is precisely where they mean to be, facing outward with the deliberateness of someone who has placed themselves for a purpose. She was pale. This was the word Clara Holt used 3 times in her statement. Pale. Not the ordinary pallor of someone cold or unwell, but a pallor that the fog itself seemed to be contributing to, as though the woman and the fog were collaborating in the production of this whiteness. She was wearing dark clothing, a dark dress or coat, and her hair was loose around her shoulders in a way that was unusual for a woman on the street at night. Unusual in a way that was difficult to define, but clearly felt by Clara as significant. The woman was looking directly at her. Clara stopped walking. This happened in the way that the body sometimes overrides the mind. She did not decide to stop. She simply stopped, her feet making the decision independently. For a moment nothing happened. The fog moved slowly around both of them. The gas lamp further up the street made its tiny, inadequate glow. Then the pale woman spoke. "It will happen again tonight," she said. The voice was Clara struggled in her statement to describe it, and the struggling is itself revealing. She tried several words: low, flat, old, not right. What she settled on at last was, like someone saying something they have said many times before in the same words without feeling them anymore. Like a message delivered, not a thing said. Clara asked, she told the police, who the woman was and what she meant. The pale woman looked at her for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked, not away, not in any ordinary direction. She walked toward the gates of the church, and Clara watched, frozen on the cobblestones, as the woman walked through the gates. The gates were locked. She had not opened them. The padlock was in place, clearly visible even through the fog. The gates had not moved, and the woman had passed through them as though they were not there, as though the iron bars and the padlock and the stone pillars to which they were affixed were simply an arrangement of shadow that she need not trouble herself with. Clara Holt ran. She ran without looking back, down Flower and Dean Street to White's Row and up to her boarding house, where she hammered on the door until the landlady came down in her nightgown with a candle and an expression of profound irritation. Clara could not explain, immediately, what had happened. She sat in the landlady's kitchen and shook, and when the trembling slowed, she told the story to the landlady, who listened with increasing skepticism and suggested that the fog had played tricks, that Clara was tired, that the mind under the influence of fear and exhaustion produces what it is expecting to see. Clara Holt listened to all of this and said, firmly, that she knew the difference between what the mind produced and what the eyes actually saw. She was there, she told the police the next morning. She was real, and she walked through those gates as though they were made of nothing. The police listened. Detective Sergeant Aberline, who had been called in to take the statement himself, wrote carefully in his notebook. He asked Clara to repeat certain details, the color of the dress, the quality of the voice, the exact words spoken, and she repeated them without variation, the mark of a witness who is not constructing a narrative but reporting a memory. That night, the night of October the 11th, the bell rang. 5 strokes this time, at 13 minutes past midnight. Several residents of Flower and Dean Street heard it. A constable on his beat heard it and noted the time. Aberline, who had given instructions to be woken if the bell was heard, received the message at 1 in the morning and dressed quickly and went to Lemon Street, where he found 2 other detectives and 3 constables already gathered. They found a body at 2 in the morning on Burner Street, a quarter-mile from St. Anselm's. The details of the death matched the pattern that had made the newspapers scream all autumn. Clara Holt was not found that morning. She was not found the next morning. She was not found, in fact, for another 6 days, and when she was, it was not in any location that could be explained by her normal routine. She was found in the basement of an unoccupied building on Commercial Street, sitting in a chair, unharmed, with no memory of having been there or of the preceding 6 days. She would not speak again about what she had seen at the gates of St. Anselm's. When anyone asked, her face would go very still and she would look at something just past the questioner's shoulder, something that wasn't there, and after a moment she would say, "I have nothing further to add." Aberline visited her 3 times. Each time she said, "I have nothing further to add." On his 3rd visit she added before he could leave, "She said it would happen again tonight, and it did happen, and it will happen again." She paused. "She said that too, she just didn't say it to me." Aberline sat with this for a moment. "What do you mean?" he asked. Clara Holt looked at him with an expression that was not fear, exactly, and not quite sadness. Something between the two. "She wasn't talking to me," said Clara. "When she said it, she was already saying it to someone else somewhere. She was delivering the same message somewhere that I happened to overhear it." A pause. "I don't think she knew I was there." She looked down at her hands. "She was like an echo," said Clara Holt. "Like a sound that keeps going after the thing that made it is gone." The fog moved through the streets below her window. Somewhere in the distance, a horse cried out. A short, sharp sound quickly cut off, and then the night was quiet again, and the quiet had, as it always did in Whitechapel in those autumn weeks, the quality of something that was not actually quiet at all. Chapter 5: The Second Murder. It was Constable Joseph Briggs who heard the bell on the night of the 15th of October, and it was Constable Joseph Briggs who subsequently, in a report that caused his superiors considerable administrative discomfort, put the timing down in official police records for the first time. Briggs was 26, the son of a Whitechapel butcher, which meant he had grown up understanding that the neighborhood had a character of its own that had nothing to do with the newspaper's descriptions of it. He knew which alleys to avoid and which to pass through quickly. He knew which figures in doorways were harmless and which were not. He knew the sound of Whitechapel at every hour, the specific pitch of the neighborhood's noise at 10 in the evening versus midnight versus 3 in the morning, the way the silence changed quality as the night deepened, becoming not quieter but more concentrated, as though the darkness were drawing sound into itself. He knew what the bell of St. Anselm's sounded like at midnight. He had heard it before, on September 29th, and on October 11th, and he had made unofficial notes in his personal book, not in his official report, because he was not entirely sure how to report a bell ringing in a locked building without appearing either credulous or unstable. On the night of October 15th, he heard it at 12 past midnight, 4 strokes, slow, from the direction of Flower and Dean Street. He was on his beat near the junction with Commercial Street, and he stopped walking and stood still and counted the strokes and noted the time and wrote it, immediately, in both his personal book and his official report, because he had decided that whatever the professional consequences, this information belonged on the record. He then did something that had not been part of anyone's instructions. He ran toward the church. He arrived at the front of St. Anselm's within 3 minutes of the final stroke. The padlock was in place. The gates were shut. The church was dark and silent. He stood on the pavement before it with his lamp held high and looked at every visible surface of the building, the nave walls, the tower, the bell chamber above, and saw nothing. No movement, no light. The fog was heavy and it obscured the upper portions of the tower, making the bell chamber invisible, but below the fog line there was nothing. He walked around the building, following the narrow passage between its north wall and the adjacent lodging house, then behind to the graveyard, where the graves were old, and the ground between them was soft with the accumulated dampness of seasons. He walked the perimeter with his lamp and his eyes, and his heart knocking in a way that he chose not to mention in his official report. He found nothing at the building. What he found in the street 20 minutes later was the crowd. It had gathered with the extraordinary speed that Whitechapel crowds achieved in those weeks, the gathering of people who are all waiting for the same news and who converge on its location the moment word begins to spread. There were 30 people in the street by the time Briggs arrived, and more coming, and above them all the gas lamp made its amber light, and below it Briggs could see, between the pressing bodies, the unmistakable shape of a constable crouching over something on the pavement. Another woman had been found, outside the front of a butcher's shop on Buck Lane. The details were in keeping with the pattern. The time was approximately 12:30, perhaps 18 minutes after the bell had finished ringing. Briggs stood at the edge of the crowd and looked at the scene, and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the October air. It was the crowd that noticed it first, or rather, one man in the crowd, a former stonemason named Henry Driscoll, who happened to be standing closest to the wall, who noticed the mark on the brickwork beside the body. "There's something cut here," he said, loudly enough for several people around him to turn. "On the wall, cut into the brick." Inspector Edmund Reed, who arrived at the scene minutes later, had the crowd pushed back and the area cleared. He examined the mark with his lamp held close. It was a symbol, not words, not any letter he recognized, but a symbol geometric composed of overlapping angles and a central circle, carved into the mortar between two bricks with something sharp and precise. It was not large, perhaps 3 inches in its widest dimension, and it had been carved with what appeared to be considerable care, suggesting unhurried attention to detail that was, given the circumstances, deeply unnerving. Reed photographed it, he made a sketch of it, he filed his report. What he did not know, on the night of October the 15th, was that the same symbol appeared in 12 other locations in the neighborhood. Aberline discovered this over the following days, as he began the systematic examination of the surrounding area that the mark had prompted. The symbol appeared on 2 other walls near the sites of previous murders, in places that could only be noticed by someone looking carefully. It appeared on a stone in the graveyard of St. Anselm's. It appeared, scratched into the stone of the doorframe on the locked front door of the church itself. It appeared inside the church. He found it on his return visit, carved into the underside of a pew, and again on the wall of the vestry where Father Harrow had died. He found it finally in Father Harrow's fragment of journal, drawn in the margin of the entry about the bell. Harrow had drawn it in the same hand as the text, with the same agitated spacing, and had written beside it only, "I have found this before. I do not know what it means, but I believe I know what it is for." Aberline sat in the diocesan basement with Patterson's asthmatic breathing beside him and the damp records around him, and looked at the symbol in the dead priest's handwriting, and thought about what something could be for. The symbol, he was told by a professor at King's College whom he consulted in some desperation, bore a resemblance to certain medieval European ritual notation, the kind used in texts that dealt with the calling and directing of what the professor, with the particular caution of academia, described as spiritual agencies. He then became uncomfortable, and said he was not the right person to consult, and suggested a colleague who was, he admitted reluctantly, more expert in these matters. The colleague's name was Dr. Arthur Pemberton. He was 60, with a reputation that was distinguished in proportion to how rarely it was mentioned in polite company. He had spent 40 years studying what he described, with no embarrassment whatsoever, as the formal mechanisms of interaction between the material and immaterial worlds. When Aberline showed him the symbol, Pemberton looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This is a summoning mark. More specifically, it is a binding mark within a summoning context." He looked up at Aberline. "Someone has been marking murder sites, or rather, someone has been preparing sites. The marking and the murder may not be as separate as you're assuming." "You mean the symbol causes the murder?" "I mean," said Pemberton carefully, "that the symbol and the murder may both be components of the same action, the way that a musical note and the vibration of a string are components of the same sound." He looked back at the drawing. "This pattern, these overlapping angles, this circle, I've seen this in 17 different sources, spanning 6 centuries and 4 countries. In every source it is associated with the same function." He paused. "It calls something. It calls it to a specific location. And then it anchors it there." "Anchors what?" said Aberline. Pemberton looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years watching the rest of the world catch up. "Whatever made the bell ring," he said. Chapter 6. Below the church. The tunnels beneath St. Anselm's were not on any plan. This was itself a discovery of some significance, because London was comprehensively planned, its subterranean geography documented in the archives of the Metropolitan Board of Works, with the thoroughness of a city that had been building beneath itself for as long as it had been building above. There were sewer maps, utility maps, the beginnings of what would eventually become the underground Old Plague Pit records, records of Roman infrastructure buried under subsequent centuries of construction. The ground beneath London was known. But the tunnels beneath St. Anselm's Church, Flower and Dean Street, Whitechapel, were not on any document in any archive that Aberline's increasingly frantic research was able to locate. He found the entrance to the tunnels on the 21st of October, on his 3rd visit to the interior of the church. He had brought with him, on this visit, Dr. Arthur Pemberton, Constable Mills, and a locksmith named George Graves, who had been recommended to him as someone who asked few questions, which proved accurate. He had also brought better lamps, a long rope, and the kind of systematic intention that comes from having run out of more conventional approaches. The entrance was in the crypt beneath the nave. The crypt itself was accessed through a trapdoor behind the altar, the existence of which Aberline had not noticed on his first 2 visits, because it had been covered by the altar cloth, or what remained of the altar cloth, a heavy liturgical embroidery now reduced to threads and mold, and by 17 years of undisturbed dust. George Graves found it by the specific hollow sound of the flagstone when he walked across it, a sound that stops a man who knows buildings the way that musicians hear a note that is almost but not quite correct. They descended into the crypt by a short flight of stone steps. The crypt was low-ceilinged and divided by stone pillars into several chambers, and it smelled of the particular deep cold that is older than any specific winter, the cold of stone that has been below the sunlight for a very long time. Niches in the walls held the remains of what had once been coffins, now collapsed to fragments, the remains within them reduced by centuries to chalky impressions. At the far end of the largest chamber, behind a stone pillar, they found a doorway. Not a trapdoor, not a hidden panel, an actual doorway, arched, stone-framed, old, much older than the church built in 1852, old in the way that some underground things are old, with an age that belongs to the geology rather than the architecture. The door itself was iron, massive, and it was open. Not slightly open or recently opened. It had been open for a long time, long enough that the hinges had seized in their current position, the rust of decades having fixed them as firmly as if they had been welded. Pemberton crouched to examine the threshold. He ran his finger along the stone and looked at what it collected. "Passage," he said. "Recent passage. Someone has been through this door within the past month." Beyond the door, the tunnel began. It was roughly circular in cross-section, perhaps 6 feet high at its center, faced with old brick that had gone dark with moisture and age. The floor was packed earth, soft and damp, and it bore the marks of recent foot traffic, the same large, long-strided prints that Aberline had found on the tower stairs, pressed into the earth in the same directional pattern, moving into the darkness ahead. Mills held his lamp up. The tunnel curved away to the right, its end invisible. They entered. The tunnel was not a short passage. Following it, with their lamps held before them and the sound of their own footsteps absorbed by the damp earth walls, they walked for what Aberline later estimated at 300 yards, though the disorientation of underground movement made accurate estimation difficult. The tunnel curved and divided twice. At each division, Pemberton chose their direction based on some criterion he did not explain, and Aberline, who had no better principle to apply, followed without argument. Along the walls they found things. Old iron rings set into the brickwork at intervals, the purpose of which was unclear. Numbers scratched into the brick at head height, a series that appeared to count, but according to no system Aberline recognized, not consecutive, not random, but following some logic that remained opaque. And in one section on the right wall for a stretch of perhaps 20 feet, a series of markings. The marks were the same symbol that had been found carved into walls near the murder sites, the overlapping angles, the central circle, but here they were not small and discrete. Here they were part of something larger, repeated and connected, interlocking into a pattern that covered the entire surface of the brickwork. Pemberton stopped before this section and stood very still for a long time. "How old," Aberline asked, "is this tunnel?" "Medieval," said Pemberton without hesitation. 14th century, possibly earlier. He touched the marked section of wall, but the markings, some of them are old. He pointed to a section. "These are old centuries, but these." He pointed to another section where the marks appeared darker, less weathered, less absorbed by the surface. "These are recent. Within the past year, someone has been refreshing them, renewing them." Graves, the locksmith, who had been silent since descending into the crypt with the air of a man who had agreed to open a lock, and had not anticipated anything beyond that, made a small sound and pointed his lamp ahead. The tunnel opened into a chamber. It was natural rather than constructed, a low oval space where the earth had given way around a foundation of limestone, creating a cavity that the tunnel connected to. In the center of the chamber, on a flat limestone shelf that served as a kind of natural table, was a collection of objects. Candles, real tallow candles, many of them burned to stubs, but the stubs fresh enough to show recent use. An iron box open containing papers. A bell, small, handheld, the kind used in certain ritual contexts, its bronze surface smooth with handling. And on the limestone shelf beneath all of this, carved into the rock itself with a depth and deliberateness that spoke of many hours of careful work. The symbol, large, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, the most complete and elaborate version of it they had yet found. Aberline took the iron box. He opened the papers inside it. The first was a list of names and dates, 12 entries. He recognized 3 of the dates immediately. They were the dates of 3 of the 1888 murders. He recognized the handwriting from the fragment of Harrow's journal in the diocesan archive. Father Edmund Harrow had compiled this list 18 years before the murders that corresponded to the last 3 dates. He had listed the murders before they occurred. The second paper was a single page of writing in the same hand, a fragment without beginning or end that read, "Cannot be unmade now. The interval shortens. What began in the founding cannot be concluded by the abandonment of the church. The church is not the source but only the first mark, and the marks are elsewhere and will not be removed by any human hand. The bell will ring. The bell has always rung. My failure is in having found the tunnel too late to understand what I found there, and in understanding too late that the offering required is not." There the fragment ended. The paper was dated November 4, 1870. Father Edmund Harrow had died on November 19, 1870. He had been writing this in the final weeks of his life. He had known about the tunnel, had found the chamber, had been down here reading and writing and trying to understand. And then he had died, and the tunnel had been sealed behind him, and the church had been locked, and Whitechapel had moved on from one poverty to the next, and the machinery in the darkness below had gone on doing what it had always done, at whatever interval it chose, with its symbol and its candles and its ancient carved stone table. Mills's lamp, which had been burning for longer than the others, flickered and began to dim. "We should go," said Graves, who had not spoken in 40 minutes and clearly had much he wished to say as soon as he was above ground. They went. They walked back through the tunnel with the flickering lamp throwing complicated shadows and the sound of water dripping somewhere ahead of them in the dark. The chamber dwindled behind them and the tunnel curved, and the darkness pressed in on the edges of their light, and somewhere, Aberline was certain, though he said nothing and made no note of it in his official report, somewhere in the tunnel behind them, something moved. Not the sound of their own footsteps, not a rat which makes a specific and recognizable sound in underground spaces, a light scrabbling irregularity. This was a single sound, a slow, deliberate footfall, then silence. They climbed out of the crypt into the nave of the church, and Aberline pulled the trapdoor shut and stood on it for a moment before stepping aside. The silence of the nave was large around them, and the light through the high windows was failing. The afternoon was ending, and the dead pigeons in their corners were pale and still. He looked at Pemberton. "The tunnel connects," Aberline said. "Where does it connect to?" Pemberton had the papers from the iron box. He looked up now with an expression that Aberline would later struggle to describe. Not fear, exactly, though fear was present. Something beyond fear, the expression of a man whose theoretical understanding has just become practical. "It connects," said Pemberton, "to every location where a mark has been found. I believe the chamber is the center of a pattern, and the pattern extends through these tunnels to the sites. That's how the mark was placed at the murder sites before anyone was there to place it." He paused. "And it's how the body was directed, not followed to those locations. Directed. The tunnel connects them and the marks orient the connection." "You're saying someone was underground," said Aberline, "moving underground between sites." "I'm saying," said Pemberton with great care, "that someone was underground, and that what they were moving may not be someone at all." Chapter 7, The Bell Ringer. He called himself Silas, and he had no surname that he was willing to provide, and the single room above the Victoria lodging house on Dorset Street, where he had lived for an indeterminate period, was so stripped of identifying material that it might have been a cell, or a waiting room, or the room of a man who expected, at any moment, to leave and leave nothing behind. He was perhaps 60. He was perhaps 40. Age had done something to him that was difficult to categorize, not aging in the ordinary sense of the word, but a kind of weathering, as though he had been outside for too long in too many varieties of weather, and the result was something that no longer responded to conventional temporal estimation. His eyes, very pale, very still, were the eyes of a man who has seen things that have reorganized his relationship with what is real and what is not. He came to Lemon Street Police Station on the morning of October the 23rd and asked to speak to someone about the bell at St. Anselm's. He did not ask to speak to anyone in particular. He sat in the waiting area with his hands on his knees and waited with the patience of someone who is accustomed to waiting, because patience is all he has to offer against the alternative. Aberline found him there and brought him to a room where there was a table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked out on a brick wall. Silas sat. He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked at Aberline. "I went into the tower," he said without preamble, "once, last winter." "How?" said Aberline. "The door in the south face, the ledge." He said this without drama, as though climbing along a ledge 30 feet above a street in winter were simply a method of transportation. The door was not locked. Someone had taken the lock away. "You went up to the bell chamber?" "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. I slept near the church sometimes, in the doorway of the building next to it, the one where the door is set back enough to give shelter. I was there many nights, and I heard the bell many times. A pause. I wanted to know. And what did you find? Silas moved his hands on the table, a slow, describing gesture. I found someone at the rope, he said. In the bell chamber, someone ringing the bell. Aberline sat very still. Describe them. Tall, said Silas. Taller than a tall man. I don't mean this imprecisely. I mean the proportions were not quite right for a man of that height. Narrow. A coat that was too long, that pooled on the floor. The hands on the rope were bandaged, white cloth stained, as though something had been done to them or something was wrong with them that required covering. You saw the face. Silas looked at the table. There was a hood, he said. A deep hood. I came close enough that I should have been able to see a face. There was moonlight coming through the arch, and it was falling directly on the figure, and I came within 6 feet of it. He paused for a long time. There was no face. I mean, the hood was empty. Or not empty, there was something in the hood, a shape, a quality of shadow that suggested a face, but not a face, not a thing with eyes and a nose and a mouth, something else. In the quiet room, Aberline heard the traffic from the street below. A cart wheel, a shout, the ordinary sounds of the city conducting its ordinary business. It did not acknowledge you, he said. It did not react. I was 6 feet away and it pulled the rope and it did not react to me at all, not as though it did not notice me, as though I was not relevant to what it was doing. He swallowed. As though I was not the kind of thing that it would notice, even if it could. And when the ringing stopped, I ran, said Silas. I was not ashamed of running. I went down the stairs and out of the church and I did not go back near it, not for months. He looked up. But I heard the bell from Dorset Street from a distance, and I felt, he seemed to struggle with this. I felt that it knew I had been there, not the figure, the bell, as though my having come close to it was registered in the way that, he stopped. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it adequately, said Aberline. Silas looked at him. You've been inside. Yes. The crypt. Yes. Silas looked at his hands again. They were trembling slightly. Aberline now noticed a small, fine tremor that suggested not fear in this moment but something that had been happening for a long time, a residual vibration in a man who had been frightened for long enough that the fear had become structural. The tunnels, said Silas. You know about the tunnels. There are homeless people in this neighborhood who have lived here for a long time, said Silas, who know things about the ground beneath the streets. Things that nobody officially knows because the officially knowing requires someone to be down there to see, and most people do not go down. He paused. The tunnels have been there for a very long time, longer than the church. The church was built over the tunnel entrance. I don't know if that was an accident. What do you know about the chamber? Silas was quiet for a long time. Then, the people who were here before the people who are here now, they knew about what was below. Not the specifics, the general shape of the thing. They called it, he paused. The names don't translate. The nearest thing in English would be something like the hunger or the call, an entity that is not alive in the way that we are alive but is present in the way that something very old can be present, by virtue of having been there long enough to become part of the place itself. And the bell. The bell calls it to focus, brings its attention to a specific point. He paused. Like calling a dog's name, the bell is the name. Who rang the bell? Silas looked at him with his pale, still eyes. Not who rang it, he said with quiet precision. The question is what rang it. The figure in the chamber, I don't think there was anything inside that coat. I think the coat was animated the way that the bell was rung, from somewhere else. By something that can reach from its location in the tunnel or the chamber or wherever it truly exists and move physical objects and create the sound it needs. He said this without drama. He said it as a man reports something he has arrived at through observation and reluctant reasoning, not as a man offering supernatural speculation. Aberline looked at him. The figure I saw in September, said Aberline. The figure the watchman saw, moving up the tower after the bell had finished ringing. "Yes," said Silas. "It was returning." "Yes." "To where?" Silas looked at the wall, the blank brick wall beyond the window. "To wherever it comes from," he said. "To the tunnel, the chamber, the thing in the chamber." He stopped. He picked up his hands from the table and held them before his face for a moment, looking at them. "I used to read," he said, which seemed disconnected until he continued. "I read a great deal, before I lived as I live now. I read a paper once by a man at Oxford about the mechanisms of haunting. He said," he paused, recalling, "he said that the most dangerous hauntings are not the ones where a ghost is attached to a place. Those are comprehensible. The ghost was a person, it died in the place, it remains connected to the place. You can understand the logic even if you can't do much about it." He lowered his hands. He said the most dangerous hauntings are the ones where the place itself is the ghost, where the location has accumulated enough of what he called psychic gravity to become self-perpetuating, where it doesn't need a person to have died there. It needs only to be there long enough for the pattern to establish itself. He paused. He said that in those cases the haunting does not end with the death of anyone. It ends only when the place is unmade. The room was quiet. He said, Silas added very quietly, that those hauntings always announce themselves with sound. Always. A specific, recurring sound at the threshold moments, at midnight, at the turning of seasons, before acts of violence. Because the pattern needs to be heard. It needs to resonate. It maintains itself through resonance. Aberline looked at this man, this nameless, weathered man who slept in doorways and knew things he should not know, who had gone into the tower of a haunted church out of the simple and terrible human need to understand, and who had found there something that could not be understood by any framework he had available. "You said the figure had bandaged hands," he said. "Yes." "And blood-stained sleeves." "Yes, dark stains, old-looking, not fresh." "What do you think that means?" Silas was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said at last, "that some things wear the evidence of what they have done for a very long time, that whatever acts have been committed in connection with this place leave their marks not only on the physical sites but on the mechanism, the thing itself." He looked up, "like a weapon that is never cleaned." He sat back in his chair. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical, the tiredness of a man who has been carrying a specific knowledge in isolation for too long and has only now found someone to put it down with. "What happens now?" he asked. Aberline looked at his notebook, which contained more words than he had ever written in a single session, and none of which he was certain he could put in an official report. "Now," he said, "I go back to the church." Chapter 8. The Letter. The letter arrived at Scotland Yard on the morning of October the 26th, and it was different from the other letters they had been receiving. They had received many letters. The public, in its alternating horror and fascination with the murders, had generated an enormous correspondence directed at the police and the newspapers, letters of outrage, letters of suggestion, letters purporting to identify the murderer, who was, depending on the correspondent, a Jewish butcher, a disgraced surgeon, a member of the royal family, a supernatural entity, or in one memorable case, 3 separate people acting in coordination. There had been the original Jack the Ripper letter and subsequent letters in the same or similar hand. There had been a postcard. There had been a letter containing what was claimed to be, and may have been, a portion of a human kidney. The police had developed a protocol for receiving such letters that involved gloves, careful logging, and a systematic skepticism that had served them well enough. But when Detective Inspector Reed opened the envelope that arrived on the morning of October the 26th, addressed in handwriting that was immediately distinctive, small, precise, controlled, the hand of a man who wrote rarely but carefully when he did, and read what was inside, he set it down on his desk and sat for a moment before picking it up again. Then he sent for Aberline. The letter was written in black ink on paper of reasonable quality, not the cheap ruled paper of most public correspondence. It was not signed. It was not addressed to anyone specifically. It read in its entirety: "When the bell tolls next, London shall witness another offering. This is not a warning. It is an announcement. The mechanism does not require your understanding to function, nor does it require your permission. It has functioned for longer than your institution has existed, and it will continue to function after your institution is a curiosity for historians. But I am aware that the announcement will be received as a warning, and I have not the heart to correct the misapprehension of a frightened city. Consider it a warning if you wish. Take whatever measures seem useful to you. They will not be useful, but they may provide some comfort in the interval. What is below Flower and Dean Street has been below Flower and Dean Street since before there was a street there. What rang the bell this September has rung bells in other places, in other centuries, for purposes that your legal framework does not accommodate. It is not malicious. Malice requires intention of a kind that this entity does not possess. It is simply what it is, and what it is requires occasional expression, the way a fire requires occasional fuel. The city provides the fuel. The mechanism provides the expression. I have tried to stop it. I tried in 1870 with inadequate tools and insufficient knowledge. I failed, and the failure cost me something I would rather not enumerate here. I tried again in the 1880s with better tools and a clearer understanding of the mechanism's nature, and I achieved a partial interruption, 3 years without the bell, without the offering, that cost me considerably more than my failure had. I cannot try a third time. The instrument is not indefinitely renewable. The handwriting, you will note if you consult the appropriate records, matches that of Father Edmund Harrow, who died in the vestry of St. Anselm's Church in November of 1870. I am aware of the implications. I offer no explanation that would fit within your current frameworks. I ask only that you note what is written here, because some record ought to exist, and this appears to be where the record will be kept. Find the final name in the chamber. Read it before the next bell. There was dried blood on the paper, a single dark smear in the upper right corner, old and oxidized to brown, cracking slightly at the edges as the paper had dried after being folded. Aberline read the letter twice, very carefully, in the way he read everything, treating words as evidence, giving each one its appropriate weight. When he finished, he set it down on Reed's desk and looked at his senior officer. Reed was looking at the letter. "Harrow died in 1870, said Reed. "Yes," said Aberline. "This letter arrived this morning." "Yes." "The handwriting matches." "I have compared it to the fragment in the diocesan archive." "Yes, the match is very close. The same distinctive formation of the letter E, the same compressed spacing on certain letters, the same," he paused. "It is the same hand." Reed looked at him. "That's not possible." Aberline, who had been underground in the crypt and in the tunnels and who had spoken to a homeless man with pale eyes and had read the incomplete writings of a dead priest, and who had held his lamp up in a chamber beneath a locked church and seen a stone table with a large symbol carved into it, arranged his face in the expression of a practical man and said, "I would like to return to the church today." "For what purpose?" "The letter says to find the final name. In the chamber," he looked at Reed. "I found a list in the iron box, names of victims with dates, but the last several were blank entries without names, only dates." He paused. "I would like to see if there is now a name in one of those entries." Reed looked at him for a long time. "Take Mills," he said, "and come back with something I can put in an official report." Aberline took Mills and Dr. Pemberton and went back to the church. They descended to the crypt and through the tunnel to the chamber, and Pemberton held the lamp over the limestone shelf while Aberline opened the iron box. The papers were as he had left them. The list was as he had left it, with its blank final entries, except that the first blank entry, which had been blank 2 days ago, now contained a name written in the same small, precise, controlled hand as the letter that had arrived at Scotland Yard that morning. The name was Frederick Aberline. Below the name was a date, November 1, 1888, which was 6 days away. Mills made a sound. Pemberton said nothing. Aberline looked at his own name written in a dead man's hand in a chamber beneath a locked church in Whitechapel, and he felt the cold move through him with a completeness that had nothing to do with temperature. Then he took the list and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "Come," he said. They went back through the tunnel, through the crypt, up into the nave. Outside in the October air, Whitechapel carried on its noisy, suffering, ordinary life. Carts and horses, children and shouting, the smell of the bakery 2 streets over, the distant sound of the river. Aberline stood on the pavement in front of St. Anselm's and looked up at the tower. 6 days. The bell had something to say about the 1st of November, and it intended to say it at 12 past midnight, and whatever it was going to say concerned him specifically. He was, as he had always been, a practical man. He had 6 days to decide what to do about it. Chapter 9. The Night of the Storm. The storm began on the afternoon of October the 31st, and escalated through the night of the 1st of November with the deliberate intensity of weather that appears to have a purpose. By 9 in the evening, the rain was falling in quantities that taxed the inadequate drainage of Whitechapel's streets, pooling in the uneven cobblestones, flowing in dark rivers along the gutters, cascading from every roof and ledge and outcropping of the densely packed buildings. The wind came with it, a sustained pressure from the east, off the river, carrying river smell and the cold of open water, and, intermittently, the sound of vessels somewhere in the dark below Limehouse, their bells and horns muffled by the storm. The gas lamps on Commercial Street flickered and bent. Several went out. The darkness between the surviving lamps became absolute, a wall of black water. In the lodging houses along Flower and Dean Street and Dorset Street and Thrall Street, the residents who had already been keeping indoors since nightfall for reasons unrelated to the weather found additional reason to stay in. No one who did not have to be outside was outside. The streets of Whitechapel on the 1st of November, 1888, at 9 o'clock in the evening, were as empty as they had ever been. Aberline was in the church. He had gone in at 7. He had gone in alone, which was against the instructions he had given himself after the crypt, and was against the express preference of Detective Inspector Reed, and was against the quiet, firm advice of Dr. Pemberton, and was against everything that any reasonable man would have recommended. He had gone in alone because he had thought, carefully and over 6 days, about the dynamics of the situation. And he had concluded that whatever was going to happen at 12 past midnight in the church of St. Anselm's on the 1st of November was going to happen regardless of who was present, and that if his name was in the book, then the thing that had written his name there had chosen him for a reason, and the reason might be something other than what it appeared. He had told no one else this reasoning, because he suspected it was the reasoning of a man who has been frightened for long enough to start making irrational decisions and calling them logical. But he had gone in alone. He sat in the bell chamber at the top of the tower with a good lamp and a blanket and a notebook and his service revolver, the last of which he acknowledged was almost certainly useless, but whose presence was comforting in the way that the presence of useless things can be comforting, when one is sitting alone in a haunted bell tower waiting for midnight. He had been there for 5 hours. In those 5 hours he had observed many things. He had observed the storm through the open arches of the chamber, the rain coming in sheets across the rooftops below, the lightning flickering at intervals over the eastern sky, the thunder following at distances that told him the worst of the storm was somewhere over the Thames estuary and moving inland. He had observed the great green bell above him, its surface beaded with moisture from the driven rain, hanging still and enormous in its ancient frame. He had observed the rope, coiled on the chamber floor, still showing the marks of recent handling. He had also observed, at approximately 11 in the evening, that the sound of the storm below was changing. Not diminishing, the wind and rain were, if anything, increasing, but the quality of the sound was altering, in the way that sounds alter when the medium through which they travel changes. The roar of rain on cobblestones was acquiring an additional resonance, something below the threshold of the ordinary sound range, something felt rather than heard, a vibration in the floor of the chamber and in the walls and in the frame of the bell above him. He put his hand on the stone floor. Yes, vibration, rhythmic, slow, like a pulse so slow that each beat was separated from the next by many seconds. He looked at the bell rope. At 11:15, the rope began to move. Not dramatically, not with the sudden decisive movement of a rope pulled by human hands, rather with the slow, incremental shift of something that is being gathered, the way tension accumulates in a cable before a load is applied. The coil on the floor stirred. The rope above the coil stiffened. The rope going up toward the mechanism above the bell tightened. Aberline stood up. He crossed the chamber floor and looked up at the mechanism. The wheel that the rope ran through was beginning to turn, slowly, minutely, but turning. He looked at the rope. There was no one holding it. There was no one in the chamber but himself. The arches were open to the storm and nothing was outside them but rain and darkness and 50 feet of Whitechapel air between the tower and the next building. Nothing was in the chamber. Nothing was touching the rope. The rope was moving by itself. He took hold of it. The rope was warm, room temperature perhaps, or slightly above. In the cold, wet air of the chamber on a November night of storm, room temperature on a rope felt distinctly warm, distinctly animate, and the sensation of the rope in his hands was not the sensation of a rope being pulled by a mechanical system. It was the sensation of a rope being held by something. He held on. The mechanism turned. The rope pulled. The bell above him swung on its pivot, and the clapper, driven by the momentum of the swing, struck the interior of the bell with a force that went through Aberline's body like a physical blow. Boong. The sound was immense in the confined space of the chamber. It hit the walls and came back. It went through the open arches and rolled out over Whitechapel and through the rain and the storm and over the rooftops of the East End. Aberline held the rope and held his ground, and the sound of the bell poured over him and through him, and he felt himself at the center of something enormous and old. Something that was using the bell the way a human voice uses a resonating chamber. Something that was speaking through the architecture of the moment, announcing itself or something else, in a language that needed no words. He held the rope. The second stroke came, the third, the fourth. After the fourth stroke, Aberline let go. Or rather, the rope let go of him. The warmth went out of it between one heartbeat and the next, and it was cold rope in his cold hands, and when he looked up the mechanism was still and the bell was still mid-swing, decelerating in its pendulum arc, the final echoes of the fourth stroke rolling away through the storm. He stood in the center of the chamber. Then he went to the arch that faced south, toward Commercial Street, and looked down. The street below was flooded, water sheeting across the cobblestones in the lamplight from the two remaining gas lamps. It should have been empty. It was not empty. In the street below, standing in the flooded darkness between the gas lamps, arranged in a rough semicircle facing the tower, were figures. He could not count them precisely. The darkness and the rain and the 50 feet of elevation made individual figures difficult to distinguish. But there were many, 20, perhaps, or 30, standing without movement in the flooded street with their faces turned up toward the tower. They were absolutely still. In the driving rain, in the storm wind that bent the surviving gas lamps sideways, they were completely, unnaturally still, as though they were not in the storm but only in the vicinity of it. He looked at them for a long moment. Then from directly beside him, not from above, Not from the mechanism, not from outside, from the air in the chamber immediately to his left. The bell rang again. The fifth stroke. There was no bell beside him. There was no mechanism. There was nothing. But the sound of the bell was in his ear, enormous and close, and with a resonance that he felt in his teeth and his chest and deep in the bones behind his ears. And he stepped sideways involuntarily and looked at the space beside him, and there was nothing there. Only air, only the ordinary dimensions of an old stone chamber. He pressed his back against the wall and breathed and counted. Below in the flooded street, the figures had not moved. The clock in his head, calibrated by the long wait of 5 hours, told him it was 12 past midnight. 4 strokes had rung from the bell, and 1 from the air, and Whitechapel was below him in the storm. And in the flooded street, the silent figures stood and did not move. And somewhere far below, beneath the church, in the crypt, in the tunnel, in the chamber where his name was written in a dead man's hand, something ancient and patient and incomprehensible continued to do what it had always done, with or without his presence or his understanding or his fear. He picked up his service revolver. He looked at it for a moment. He put it back in his pocket. Then he went down the stairs, through the nave, out the door, and stood on the wet pavement in front of St. Anselm's Church in the storm of November the 1st, 1888, and looked at the place where the figures had been standing. The street was empty. The flooding rain moved over the cobblestones in sheets. The gas lamps bent. There was no one. There had been no one. He was alone in Whitechapel at midnight in a storm, with 5 bell strokes in his memory, and his name written underground in a dead man's hand. And it was 6 minutes past 12, and nothing had happened to him, and he did not know if that was because something had protected him or because something had decided, for its own reasons, that tonight was not his night. Somewhere in Whitechapel, as he would learn in the morning, someone had disappeared, not murdered, not found with the evidence of violence that characterized the other deaths. Simply gone. A resident of a boarding house on White's Row, last seen at 9 o'clock in the evening, who had left her room to go to the water closet at the end of the corridor and had never come back. The water closet was empty. The corridor was empty. The door to the street was locked from inside. She was gone with the straightforward impossibility of fog. She was never found. Chapter 10. The Secret in the Catacombs. They went down in force on the 3rd of November. 6 constables, Detective Inspector Reed, Aberline, Dr. Pemberton, and at Aberline's specific insistence, over Reed's specific objection, the man called Silas, who knew the underground better than anyone currently available. They brought proper equipment, safety lamps designed for underground work, a full reel of guide rope to mark their route, chalk for marking walls at intervals, and in the case of Constable Briggs, an expression of determined composure that Aberline recognized as a man deciding not to be afraid by a simple act of will. They descended through the trapdoor at 9 in the morning, when the daylight above was at its best, and the darkness below was therefore at its most navigable. Silas went first, at his own insistence. He moved through the tunnel with an ease that told Aberline he had been here before, not guessing at the route, not cautious in the way of someone new to a space, but moving with the minimal attention of someone following a familiar path. The tunnel seemed longer this time. Aberline had noticed this on previous descents. The underground has its own relationship with distance, compressing and extending it according to principles that are not purely physical. The 300 yards felt like 500, and then the tunnel widened and the chamber opened before them. It was larger than Aberline remembered. This was the first thing he noticed. The chamber was larger. 6 men with good lamps illuminating the space simultaneously made the dimensions unambiguous. The chamber was perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling that rose irregularly to perhaps 15 feet at its apex. And it was not, as he had believed on his previous visits, a simple oval space. It was the center of a system. 5 tunnels opened into it, not one. He had entered through the one connected to the church. The others extended into darkness in 4 other directions, and when he held his lamp to each entrance in turn, he could see, in each one, the same marks on the walls, the overlapping symbol, refreshed and renewed, extending down each tunnel as far as the light could reach. 5 directions, said Reed, who was a practical man but was finding his practicality under some strain. 5 murder sites, said Aberline. Plus the one we've come through, said Reed. The church is not a murder site. It is the anchor point, the ritual center. The murder sites radiate from it, said Pemberton. He was moving around the chamber's perimeter, his lamp held close to the walls, examining the surfaces. These marks have been here for a very long time, but the walls of the chamber, look. The walls of the chamber were covered, from floor to ceiling, with writing. This was what Aberline had failed to perceive on his previous visits, because the previous visits had been conducted in insufficient light, and with insufficient steadiness of nerve, to permit careful observation of anything that was not directly relevant to immediate exit. The writing was in multiple hands, multiple languages, multiple scripts. Some of it was in Latin, some in what Pemberton identified as medieval English, some in scripts he could not immediately identify. It covered every available surface of the chamber's stone walls, squeezed into available spaces, overlapping in places where a later writer had not been deterred by a surface already filled. People have been coming here, said Silas, which was obvious but which needed to be said. For a very long time, said Pemberton. He was moving slowly around the perimeter, reading. This is a record, people who knew about this place, who came here, who wrote what they found. He stopped at a section. This section is in Latin, 1347. I can read the date. It refers to a plague year and to the calling from beneath that preceded it. He moved along. This in English, 1593. This in what appears to be Dutch, no date. Aberline stood in the center of the chamber beside the limestone shelf and looked at the writing on all sides of him and felt the weight of centuries pressing inward from the stone. All these people, all these visitors, all these separate arrivals at the same impossible conclusion, each writing what they found, adding to the record, for reasons that might have been the same reason he was here now. The simple human need to leave evidence that you had seen what you had seen, so that if you could not stop it, at least someone would know. He looked at the limestone shelf. The iron box was still there. He opened it. The list was still there. He looked at the entries. His name was still there, Frederick Aberline, November 1, 1888. But something had changed. Below his name, in the entry that had previously been the last one, the final blank, there was now a second name, written in the same small, controlled hand. Written since the 1st of November, which meant it had been written within the past 2 days. He read the name. He read it again. He showed it to Pemberton without speaking. Pemberton read it. His expression, which had been the controlled professional expression of a man in difficult circumstances, slipped for a moment and showed something raw beneath it. The name was Arthur Pemberton. Below the name, a date, November 15, 1888. 12 days away. Well, said Pemberton after a moment, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, that is clarifying. Aberline looked at the other entries. His own name, November 1st. Nothing had happened to him on November 1st or in the days since. His name was in the book, but he was alive and unharmed. The list had been presented to him as a death list, names of victims before they were victimized, and yet here he was. The 1st of November, he said. I was in the tower, I heard the bell, but I survived. You survived, said Pemberton carefully, but someone else disappeared from White's Row. A substitution, said Silas from across the chamber. He had been looking at the wall. Look at this section. He pointed to a portion of the writing, a section in what appeared to be 18th century English. It describes the same thing. A name is written. A person arrives at the marked location. They are present when the bell rings, and he read further. And someone else is taken instead. Someone proximate. Someone in the vicinity of the named person who is present in the overlap. He looked up. The list marks those who are present at the threshold moment. It does not specify which of those present will be taken. It identifies the nexus point. The entity takes whoever is most available at the nexus. "I was in the tower," said Aberline slowly. "The woman on White's Row was in the building next to the church." "Not next to. Below," said Silas. "Which building is directly above one of the tunnel branches from this chamber?" Aberline thought. "The lodging house on White's Row, number 12, which is where she lived." "She was directly above the mechanism," said Silas. "Closer than you were." Aberline looked at Pemberton's name in the book. November 15, 1888. "We need to find out which location is above the tunnel relevant to November the 15th, he said. "And we need to ensure that Dr. Pemberton does not go anywhere near it, and anyone else who might be in the vicinity." He looked around the chamber. At the writing on all the walls, all those centuries of witnesses and recorders, all those people who had come down here and seen this, and written what they saw and gone back up and been unable to stop what happened. "We need to understand more," he said. "Pemberton, can you read all of this?" "Given time, most of it." "How much time?" Pemberton looked at the walls. "Days," he said, "at minimum." "You have 11, said Aberline. And so they began. In shifts, with adequate light and the guide rope running back to the surface, they read centuries of testimony left by the witnesses who had come before them. It was the most unusual forensic investigation that any of them would ever conduct. The entity existed. It had existed in this location for as long as anyone who had written about it could determine. It was not malicious in any human sense. It had no capacity for malice because it had no capacity for intention as humans understand intention. It operated by mechanism, the way gravity operates by mechanism, without choice and without the possibility of being reasoned with. Its mechanism required, at intervals determined by some cycle that no writer in the chamber had fully cracked, a specific kind of event at a specific kind of location. The bell was the announcement of this requirement. The tunnel was the means of its fulfillment. But buried in a section of 1683 English that Pemberton read and reread until he was certain of its meaning, the mechanism was not inviolable. It could be interrupted, not stopped, not permanently, but interrupted, delayed. The interval could be extended. And the method of extending it was specific and finite and terrible, and it had been used before, by at least 3 of the writers on the chamber walls, and it had cost each of them exactly what Harrow's fragment had suggested it would cost. Aberline read this section over Pemberton's shoulder and thought for a long time. Then he went back up through the tunnel, through the crypt into the church, out onto the wet street, and stood in the cold air of Whitechapel and looked up at the tower of St. Anselm's and thought about what it cost and whether it was payable and by whom. Chapter 11, The Final Bell. He went to the tower alone. He went at 11 o'clock on the night of November the 14th, giving himself time. He brought 2 lamps, his notebook, the revolver he acknowledged was useless, and the document that Pemberton had prepared based on the chamber writings, a careful, dense set of instructions in Pemberton's meticulous hand, written in the language of a scholar who was trying to render in modern English something that had been written in the vocabulary of a century whose understanding of what they were dealing with was simultaneously more practical and more superstitious than his own. Aberline had forbidden Pemberton from entering the church at all that night. He had arranged for 2 constables to accompany Pemberton to his home in Bloomsbury and to remain there throughout the night. He had told Pemberton this was precautionary. It was more than precautionary. The chamber writing had been specific about one thing above all others. The interruption required a voluntary presence at the bell chamber at the threshold moment, a presence that declared itself consciously and deliberately to the mechanism, that inserted itself into the cycle at the point of maximum resonance, and that, through the act of this insertion, disrupted the pattern's coherence enough to delay its next expression. The disruption was not permanent, but it was significant. The 1683 account had described an interval of 30 years achieved by this method. The 1791 account, briefer and less complete, described something similar. The mechanism did not take the person who performed the interruption. The writers had been very clear. The interruption was not a sacrifice. It was more like a counter-resonance, a sound made at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place to disrupt the mechanism's cycle. The person who did it was not consumed. They were simply changed, altered. Each writer had described the alteration differently. Some described it in physical terms: a persistent sound in the ears, a quality of cold that never entirely lifted, a tendency for the eyes to see things at the periphery of vision that vanished when looked at directly. Some described it in temporal terms: a loosening of the normal boundaries of time, a kind of overlap between moments, a difficulty distinguishing between memory and anticipation. But they were all, every one of them, still alive when they wrote their accounts. The alteration was not lethal. He had weighed this. He had spent 11 days weighing it, while reading the chamber walls in shifts and assembling a picture that was as complete as it was going to be given the available time. He had weighed it against the alternative: doing nothing, letting Pemberton go wherever the mechanism directed, and hoping that someone proximate would be taken instead. He had weighed it against other alternatives: barricading the church, flooding the tunnels, attempting some kind of physical intervention in the mechanism. All these alternatives, the chamber writings were uniform in suggesting, were ineffective. Counter-resonance, at the threshold moment, by someone who understood what they were doing and chose to do it. He understood, imperfectly, partially, in the way that you understand a language you have learned as an adult rather than as a child, correctly in the main structures but imprecise in the nuances. But enough. He climbed the tower stairs for the third time. The stone steps with their worn centers, the damp walls with their climbing shadows, the narrow spiral upward through the tower's core. He had climbed these stairs under urgency and under fear and under investigation, and tonight he climbed them with something that was not quite equanimity, but occupied the same location in his emotional geography. A settled acceptance of the present moment that was available to him, because the decision had been made, and the making of it was behind him. The bell chamber was as it always was, cold, open to the night air, the bell massive and still in its frame. The rope coiled, the arched openings with the November darkness beyond them, and somewhere below, Whitechapel going about its late business in the cold. He checked his pocket watch, 11:23. He sat on the floor of the chamber with his back against the wall that faced the bell and opened his notebook and wrote. He wrote carefully and at length, because it seemed important to him, for the same reason that all the writers in the chamber below had written, that there be a record, not an official record, a true one. He wrote about Thomas Crail and the pub on Commercial Street. He wrote about the church with its dead pigeons and its altar of dust. He wrote about the muddy footprints that went up and did not come down. He wrote about Clara Holt and the pale woman at the gate. He wrote about the crypt and the tunnel and the chamber with its 5 branches and its centuries of testimony. He wrote about Silas and his pale eyes and his homeless knowledge. He wrote about the letter in a dead man's hand. He wrote about the name in the iron box. He wrote about the storm and the rope and the 5 strokes of the bell, one of which had come from the air beside him, and the 30 silent figures in the flooded street below. He wrote, "I do not claim to understand what the entity is, in any fundamental sense. I claim only to have understood enough of its mechanism to act. The action I am about to take is based on the best evidence available to me, collected from the most reliable sources I have been able to access. If I am wrong, the consequences will fall on me alone, which is as it should be. If I am right, the mechanism will be delayed by a significant interval. The accounts suggest decades. And the people of this city, this neighborhood, this pocket of suffering that is Whitechapel, will have something that is not a solution but is at least a respite." He stopped, he looked at the bell. He wrote, "I would like to note, for whatever record this represents, that the people of Whitechapel are extraordinary. In conditions that would break most societies, they have maintained community, humor, mutual aid, and the kind of stubborn fundamental dignity that has nothing to do with wealth or status. Whatever is beneath their streets does not deserve them. They do not deserve it. If I am able to achieve even a partial interruption, it will have been worth every quality that Pemberton's account suggests it costs." He closed the notebook. 11:58. The city below was darker now. The night deepened toward its absolute center, the gas lamps doing their inadequate best against the November dark. He could see the rooftops of Whitechapel through the arches, irregular silhouettes against a sky that was overcast but not raining, the clouds low and gray, and lit from beneath by the collective illumination of London. 12 past midnight came, or rather, Aberline felt it come, the specific quality of a transition, like the pause at the top of a pendulum's arc, the momentary balance before direction reverses. The rope began to gather itself. He watched it standing now 3 feet away, the slow accumulation of tension in the coil, the rope stiffening, the fibers separating with the tension as the rope above tightened toward the mechanism. He waited for the mechanism to begin to turn. And then, when the first movement of the wheel was visible, he stepped forward and took the rope in both hands. Not to prevent the bell from ringing, he did not try to prevent it. He had understood from Pemberton's translation that prevention was not the point and was probably not possible. The point was presence. The point was a conscious mind, understanding the mechanism and choosing to engage with it at the threshold moment. The bell would ring. The mechanism would complete its first stroke. And in the moment between the first stroke and the second, while the sound was still moving through the stone and the air and the ancient physics of the tower, he would do what the documents described. He would speak the words that Pemberton had transcribed, and whose essential meaning, stripped of the various idioms of the centuries that had produced them, was, "I am here. I know what you are. I counter this. I hold this interval open." The mechanism turned, the clapper swung, the bell rang. Boong. The sound was in him and through him and around him, and he held the rope and felt the warmth in it, the same warmth he had felt on November the 1st, and he spoke. He spoke in the ordinary voice of a man speaking in a stone chamber in the dark, no ceremony, no ritual intonation, simply a man saying what needed to be said, in his own voice, in his own words. In the present tense of November the 15th, 1888. The second stroke did not come. The mechanism was engaged. The wheel was turning. He could see it above him, the massive wheel turning on its pivot, the rope running through it, everything in the physical posture of a bell about to ring a second time. But the second stroke did not come. The silence where the second stroke should have been was the loudest silence Aberline had ever experienced. It had dimension and texture, this silence. It pressed against the inside of the arched openings. It pressed against the surface of the bell. It pressed against Aberline's face and hands and chest. And then, slowly, over the course of perhaps 10 seconds, it released. The mechanism decelerated. The wheel stopped turning. The bell swung to rest. The rope in Aberline's hands went cold. He stood in the bell chamber, holding a cold rope in a cold night, and breathed. His ears were ringing. This was the first thing he noticed, a persistent, high-frequency tone in both ears that he understood from the documents would not go away. The person who performed the interruption would hear the bell in their ears for the rest of their life. Not loudly, not debilitatingly, but persistently, a constant quiet tone, the memory of the mechanism pressed into the physical structure of the inner ear. The second thing he noticed was that his hands were shaking. The third was that through the south arch in the street below there were no figures. The street was empty. The gas lamps burned. A cat moved across the cobblestones and disappeared into a doorway. Ordinary night. Ordinary Whitechapel. Ordinary everything. He had done it or he had not. He would know over the following days. If another bell ringing occurred, if another name appeared in the book, if another person died or disappeared, then he had failed. If the silence continued, if the nights passed without the bell's announcement, if the names in the box remained as they were, then perhaps, the interval had been extended. He gathered his lamps and his notebook and his useless revolver and descended the tower stairs for the last time. Outside the church, in the cold November air, he stood and looked up at the tower and at the bell chamber, now quiet and dark against the clouded sky. In his ears, very faintly, at the exact frequency of a very large bell, a tone rang. He locked the church. He pocketed the key. He walked to Lemon Street Police Station and filed the most incomplete report of his professional career, and then he went home. Chapter 12. The Legend of Whitechapel. The murders stopped. Not on November the 15th. They had, in the reckoning of the papers and the police, essentially stopped already, the last attributed murder having occurred on November the 9th, in Miller's Court, a death so terrible in its particulars that the newspapers had strained every resource of sensational language in their efforts to convey it, and had, in several cases, simply abandoned the attempt. After that, a silence settled over Whitechapel that was at first disbelieved, and then cautiously acknowledged, and then accepted with the specific relief of people who have been holding their breath for 3 months. The Ripper had stopped. Nobody knew why. Nobody ever knew why. The theories multiplied in the absence of fact. Emigration, death, incarceration, some other explanatory mechanism that turned the horror into something manageable by rendering it finished. The newspapers moved on to other horrors. The police, in due course, closed the active investigation and archived the files in that particular institutional limbo reserved for cases that are officially unsolved and expected to remain so. Detective Sergeant Frederick Aberline filed his final report on the case in December of 1888. It was, by the standards of his other reports, brief and uninformative. It noted that no further incidents had occurred. It noted that the investigation had produced no actionable leads regarding the identity of the perpetrator. It noted, in one line at the very end, that the Church of St. Anselm's, Flower and Dean Street, had been thoroughly examined and found to be structurally unsafe, and that it was recommended the building be sealed pending a decision regarding its future. He did not mention the tunnel. He did not mention the chamber. He did not mention the writing on the walls, the iron box, the symbol, the figures in the flooded street, the rope that had been warm when nothing was holding it, or the tone in his ears that had not diminished in the weeks since November the 15th. He did mention, in a personal letter to Dr. Arthur Pemberton dated the 14th of December, 1888, all of these things. The letter ran to 14 pages and was written in the methodical hand of a man who was simultaneously exhausted and compelled to record, who understood that what he had done in the tower on November the 15th had been successful in some measure that he could not quantify but could feel, the absence of subsequent bells, the absence of subsequent names, the continued survival of everyone on the list, and who wanted at least one person to have the complete account. Pemberton wrote back in January. His letter was shorter. He had returned to the chamber one final time and made a full transcription of everything on the walls that he could read, which occupied 11 pages of close academic handwriting, and which he would maintain in his personal archive, with a note of instruction that it should be preserved regardless of circumstances. He reported that he had found no new entry in the iron box. He reported that the 5 tunnels appeared undisturbed. He reported one additional thing, briefly, at the end of his letter. I noticed that you did not mention whether the tone in your ears corresponds, as I suspect it does, to the exact frequency of the bell's fundamental. If you find this is the case, I would ask you to note in your own records that this frequency appears also in the writing on the walls. It is the interval that the 1347 Latin account describes as the note before creation. I am not certain what to make of this observation, but it seems significant in ways I am not yet equipped to articulate. Aberline tested this, with the assistance of a musician friend who had a tuning fork collection, and found it to be accurate. The tone in his ears was precisely the fundamental frequency of the St. Anselm's bell. He added a note to this effect to his personal file. The church was sealed in February of 1889, as he had recommended. The building was boarded up, the windows blocked, the entrance padlocked with a new and more substantial lock. No entry was permitted for any purpose. The building became one of those closed, dark presences in the urban landscape that people learn to look past, to accommodate into their sense of the familiar in the way that one accommodates a scar. Not ignoring it, exactly, but not allowing it to dominate the visual field of daily life. Whitechapel moved on. Not quickly, not cleanly. The neighborhood had moved on from worse things before and would move on from worse things again. Because Whitechapel's extraordinary quality was its continuity of endurance, its ability to absorb horror and keep functioning, keep arguing and laughing and suffering, and loving in the cramped, overlapping, insufficient way of people who have no alternative. The autumn of 1888 was discussed, and then not discussed, and then discussed again, and then absorbed into the complicated mythology of the neighborhood. The stories people tell about places that have happened to them in order to give the happening a form that can be carried. Thomas Crail continued his nightly rounds. He walked past the sealed church on Flower and Dean Street every night for the rest of his working life, and he always paused at a specific point on the pavement and stood still for a moment, listening before moving on. He heard nothing. He told no one what he was listening for. After his retirement, when asked about the autumn of 1888 by a young journalist, he said that he had been there and that some things were not appropriate for publication. Clara Holt recovered in most senses of the word. She continued to work as a seamstress. She continued to live on White's Row. She married, in 1892, a decent man who knew something of what she had experienced and did not ask her to explain it, which was exactly what she needed. She lived to the age of 78 and died in 1935, and her granddaughter, sorting through her effects, found in a box under the bed a single piece of paper on which was written in Clara's careful hand, "She was there. She walked through. It will happen again, but not yet." The granddaughter, who had no context for this, threw the paper away. Silas, whose actual name was discovered in the 1890s to be Edward Sylvester Crane, formerly a lecturer in history at the University of Edinburgh, who had left his position in 1881 under circumstances the university records described as a significant personal crisis, found a room in Bethnal Green and a small amount of employment translating historical documents for a legal firm that specialized in old property disputes. He died in 1901 of pneumonia and left behind a locked box whose key was lost, and nobody thought to break the lock. Dr. Arthur Pemberton continued his work. He published, in 1895, a monograph titled Mechanisms of Psychic Topography in Urban Environments, which was received with the mixture of fascination and professional alarm that greeted most of his publications. He referred, in Chapter 7, to a particular London location and certain underground manuscripts of extraordinary antiquity, without identifying either. He died in 1902 at 82, in full possession of his faculties, and in the middle of a sentence he was writing, which was exactly the kind of death he would have chosen if given the option. He left the chamber transcription, with its note of instruction, to the Bodleian Library. The Bodleian filed it under miscellaneous. Years passed. The 19th century became the 20th. The East End changed and stayed the same in the proportions that East Ends maintain. The buildings shifted, the populations shifted, the specific texture of the poverty shifted with each generation's particular version of economic exclusion. But the fundamental quality of the neighborhood, its densely inhabited, stubbornly vital character, its refusal to be entirely defeated, remained essentially continuous. St. Anselm's Church deteriorated, as sealed buildings do, with the patient thoroughness of entropy meeting opportunity. The roof failed in sections. The walls developed cracks. The boards over the windows were replaced twice and then left unreplaced when they fell away, and the windows themselves eventually went, and the interior was open to weather and to birds, and to the investigations of adventurous children who found nothing interesting inside and went away. The tower remained. It was structurally sound in ways that the rest of the building was not. It stood while other portions of the church fell, rising above the roofline of the surrounding buildings, its bell chamber visible from several streets away. The bell was still in it. People occasionally heard it. Rarely, once every few years, perhaps less on rainy nights, usually in autumn, usually near midnight. Never the long sequence of strokes from the active months of 1888, just one or two tones, brief, enough to hear and doubt and hear again. Enough to stop walking and look toward Flower and Dean Street and feel, for a moment, the particular quality of unease that the sound produced regardless of whether the hearer knew anything about its history. The legend of the bell accreted around these sporadic hearings over the decades, as legends do, accumulating details from various sources, conflating different events, simplifying the complex and complicating the simple, until by the mid-20th century it had achieved the particular stability of urban folklore that is not precisely true and not precisely false, but captures something essential about the experience it describes. The story, as told in the neighborhood, was this: that in 1888, when the Ripper murders had terrorized Whitechapel, a bell in a ruined church had rung before each killing. That the bell had been investigated and found to have no physical mechanism for ringing. That a detective had spent a night alone in the tower and had done something that stopped the murders. That the detective had been, afterward, permanently marked by what he had done. That people who knew him said his hearing had changed. That he heard things others could not. That he sometimes paused in the middle of conversations and tilted his head in the direction of the East End, as though listening for something. That the church was still there. That the bell was still in it. That on rainy nights sometimes you could hear it. And when you heard it, the story went, something happened. Not always a death, not always anything as dramatic or legible as a death, but something, a disappearance, an incident, a thing that could not be explained by any framework that the explaining culture kept to hand. The church records had been thoroughly examined multiple times by multiple parties over the years. Historians, journalists, researchers into the Ripper case, paranormal investigators, and eventually a university research team that spent 3 months in the building in the 1970s with sound recording equipment and ground-penetrating radar. The ground-penetrating radar found the crypt. It did not find the tunnel. The tunnel was below the depth of the technology's effective range, and the chamber was further still. The sound recording team recorded nothing during their 3 months in the building. No anomalous sounds. No bell. The lead researcher, a skeptical physicist, published a brief report concluding that the legend was exactly that. He had not been there in November. He had not been there in rain. The 1970s research team found, in the diocesan records, a fact that none of them could entirely account for, that the original architectural drawings for St. Anselm's Church, drawn in 1851 by the architect responsible for the commission, showed the tower in full detail, its stairs, its various chambers, its bell mechanism. The drawings did not show a bell. The tower had been built without one. The specification was clear: a tower with a bell chamber, with the mechanism and structural support for a bell, but without the bell itself, which would be added at a later date pending fundraising. The fundraising had never been completed. The bell had never been purchased, never been installed, never been hung in the frame that waited for it in the tower of St. Anselm's Church. The bell that rang before every murder in Whitechapel in 1888, the bell that Thomas Crail had heard and Frederick Aberline had touched, and the residents of Flower and Dean Street had counted out in the dark. That bell had never been there. The tower was built without one. And the sound continued. Not often, not loudly, not in any way that was available to the microphones of the 1970s research team, who had been there in the wrong season, under the wrong conditions, at the wrong hour. But on rainy nights in autumn near midnight, if you stood at the correct angle to Flower and Dean Street and listened in the specific way that listening requires, not the active, straining attention of someone expecting a sound, but the relaxed, open receptivity of someone who has stopped trying to hear and is simply present. On those nights, sometimes, you could hear it. One tone, or two, low, slow, rolling across the rooftops with the deliberate patience of a sound that has been rolling across rooftops for longer than anyone alive can account for. And in the quiet after the sound, the nighttime sound of the city going about its ancient business, if you stood very still in the rain and listened again, you might hear, very faint, barely distinguishable from the wind, the way the voice of someone speaking in another room is just below the threshold of comprehension, the sound of someone in a stone chamber a long way below the street, writing, adding to the record, leaving evidence that they had been there. In Whitechapel, even now, even in the city with its reconfigured streets and its shifted populations and its new anxieties in place of the old ones, the bell still waits for midnight. The tower still stands. The chamber is still there. And the iron box, if you found it, still contains the list. The last entry, written in a hand that matches the handwriting of a man who died in 1870, is not yet filled in. It is waiting. Some sounds are not meant to come from this world. And in Whitechapel, the bell still waits for midnight.
Every time the bell rang, someone died.